All right, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at how we can actually use our new many-to-many relationship in our controllers and our views. So to do that, we need to be able to access instances of our persistent menu class and the relationships there. So we need to set up a menu data access object, or a menu DAO. So we've already done that, and this is just the exact same as we've set up our previous data access objects. We have the repository and transactional annotations here. We also have the public interface declaration, and we say that our interface extends the CRUD repository interface, and that's parameterized by the menu and integer classes. It's saying that this interface will work with instances of the menu class, and that the primary key identifiers on that class are integers. All right, so nothing else that needs to go in that class or that interface for now. Let's go ahead and look at our menu controller. And actually, before we dive into the code, let me go ahead and start up the application. That way you can see how this actually works and the different features that are actually a part of it. While we're going through the code, you can have a vision of those and how they work in your mind. All right, so let's check it out. So here is my new main view on this application, and I've just rearranged it a little bit. I've rearranged the main menu to work with the sort of main three controllers, categories, menus, and then home, which is the cheese controller main view. And then below that, we have add and remove, which are the two actions that I can take with a particular cheese object. So let's go ahead and look at the menus view. And the menus view just shows us a list of our menus. And there are two things I can do here. I can go in and look at a particular menu and see the items that are part of that menu. I can also add a new menu. So let's just do this to see how this works. Notice that when we add a menu, the only data we're working with here is the name of the menu. The items will be added in a different form. So you could potentially set this up where you could add some number of items while you were creating the menu. It's a little more complicated. I want to keep it sort of bite-sized and atomic so we can see how these components work. So I just made the add menu form such that it only takes a name and that we always create an empty menu. And I made it a little bit too long there. All right. And when I create that menu, it takes me directly to that menu itself. Notice that there's nothing in it yet. So if there are no items in the menu, I get a little message declaring that. And I can go ahead and add items to the menu by clicking on the add items link. And then from this form, I can choose the items that I want to make part of that menu. And so I can pretty quickly do that and just pile up my items to this menu. Let's add one more. And then if I go to the main menus view, we see that our last menu that we just added is there as well. Okay, so that's how this should work. Let's go ahead and go back to the application and look at the code that made all that happen. So in the menu controller, I've auto-wired both a menu DAO and a cheese DAO. I'm going to need to interact with both menu classes, menu objects, and cheese objects. So I'm going to need both of these data access objects available. And we've already talked about that, but that needs to go in every controller in which you want to access instances of those classes. My index view is fairly basic. So the index view is similar to other index views we have in this application. We add a title, and recall that the index view just shows a list of all the available menus. And so I pass into the template, I pass under the attribute name menus, I pass the result of calling menu DAO.findAll. And let's go ahead and look at that view. We can look at the views alongside each of these handlers. So the index one is here. All right, and so this will loop over the collection of menus. And for each one, it provides a link to that menu view. So we see that that URL is going to be built out of taking this string, /menu/view/ and then adding the menu ID. So we see that when we were looking at a particular menu, we had a URL of the form, or a path of the form, menu/view/5, where that last component was the ID of the given menu we were looking at. So we can see that that's how we're building up these links within the main menu's index view. And so as we're looping over this, we just call menu.id to get the ID of that menu, and then we display the menu name. Okay, so that's the index view. And then we have two methods associated with the add view. So this is again adding a new menu, and recall that it adds an empty menu. The handler associated with a get request, which is available at /menu/add, that simply adds a title, and then it returns, it passes a new menu object into the view, and that will be used to help build the form. And for form validation, we already saw that our form validation works as we tried to enter an incorrect or an invalid menu title. Let's go ahead and look at that one. So here's the template for the form to add a new menu, and this just has one form field, which is we have bound our menu object to the form, right? So recall that binding an object to a form gives us some nice validation features, and in some cases it allows us to generate the specific type of form input and etc. from the field properties of that object. And so here I just have a single field that I want to populate from this particular form, and that's the name field. So I use my th4, my th field, and my th errors, and we saw how those all worked on the front end, and nothing here is really new from what we've done before. Okay, in order to process that form, let's look at this guy. So let me actually just make this line there so you can see the entire thing. The handler to handle the post request from that form, that will take a model attribute that's going to bind the menu object to this handler, and we have the valid annotation, which is going to make sure that the validation annotations on that object are satisfied, and put any errors associated with that in this errors object. Recall that the errors object always has to come directly after the model that the errors should be associated with. And then once we're inside this handler, we check for errors. If we do have errors, we just go back basically to the same form we were at, and those errors will be displayed to the user. If we don't have any errors, we're going to save the new menu item that was created, the new menu object that was passed in via model binding. We do that by calling menu.dao.save with the new item, and then we're going to redirect, and we redirect by building up the path view/ and then the menu ID that's part of the new menu item that we created. So one thing to note here is that we never actually created the ID for this. So when you do a save on a Hibernate managed class, that will then generate the ID for that item, right? So it not only puts it in the database, it generates the ID for that item. So when we come down here, even though there was no ID in this class before, you could go ahead and set a breakpoint here and check this object as it came in and see that the ID field would have been null. Down here, it will have a value, and that is because Hibernate will give it a value when we save it to the database. And that's all due to the generated value annotation. So that's how we get a new menu. Our next set of handlers, well, let's look at our next individual handler. We've got a set of add item handlers down below, but the individual view menu handler is going to display the contents of a single menu. And that's going to be via a get request. So the way we get the particular the ID of the particular menu that we want to display is via a path variable. And so we configure our path here to be view/ and then we use the curly bracket annotation to specify that we expect there to be a path variable there, and that should be put into the menu ID input parameter. Within this class, we fetch the particular menu that we're looking at by saying menu.dao.find1, and then we add a few attributes. We add the title of the page, which is going to be just the name of the menu. We fetch all of the items or all of the cheeses that are part of that menu and pass them into the view, and then we also pass in menu.getID. And so I'll show you why we do that in just 1 second. So this will be the specific ID of the menu. So let's go ahead and look at that. So this is in the view template. All right, so the template for this will display the title, the navigation. It will loop over the list of items, displaying each of those. This is all code that we've become relatively familiar with. If there are no items in the list, we display a no items or no cheeses yet message. And down below, we saw that there was a link. Previously, when we were looking at the interface, there was a link to click on to add items to that menu. So that link needs to have information about which menu the user wants to add items to, right? So we'll see how the add item, the handler associated with this path works in just a second. That's our last set of handlers. But it makes sense, right, that if we're going to show the user a form to add an item to a menu, that form should somehow know which menu the user wants to add an item to. The way it knows is that when they click on this, it will have the menu ID as part of the path. Okay, so that's why we pass the menu ID into this particular view. Okay, and so that's how the view menu handler works. Then we have a pair of handlers down here, the add item handlers, one that's a get handler, one that's a post handler. And as we've become used to, the first one will display the form, the second one will process it. We see that since this path variable is being passed in, we just saw that that was passed in via the links that were created in the view with the handler above. We'll have a menu ID, and that will tell us which menu the user is intending to add items to. And we're going to fetch that menu by saying menu DAO.find1 with the identifier for that menu. That will fetch it out of the database. And then we're going to create this add menu item form object. And so we've done this a few times where we've created a model class specifically for rendering or processing a form. And so this is just a handy way to deal with model validation in a nice way when the when the form you're looking at doesn't correspond directly to a specific class otherwise, right? So we're not creating a new object here necessarily, we're creating a new relationship between objects. So we don't have a model class, a natural model class that we can use for form binding. So we created one called add menu item form that will be used to both render the form and to process it. Let's look at that. That's up in the forms package in our model package. And this just has the information that is necessary for creating this form. So we have menu ID and cheese ID. So these are both going to be pieces of data passed into our post handler. And these are going to specify the two objects that should be related to each other, the specific menu and the specific cheese that should be related to each other based on that form submission. We have an iterable of cheeses, this collection of cheeses. We'll use this to render the dropdown, which will give the user the option or the set of options that they can choose to add to their menu. We have a menu object itself right here. And so this is going to be needed when we're rendering the form as well. And let's see, we have a default constructor. We need a default constructor for model binding to work. And then we have a kind of more useful constructor, and this is what we'll use in our get request handler for this form. This takes in a collection of cheeses and a menu and creates a new form. Okay, and then down here, these are just the accessors that we need for this. All right, so let's go back to our controller and see what's going on here. So this model class add menu item form has all the data related with displaying and processing the form that we're looking at here. And so we create a new instance of that with the menu class, the menu object in question, and with the collection of cheeses in question as well. And then we pass that form into the view. Let's go ahead and look at that particular view. So this is our view for adding a new item. And notice that it's a form. So we have a simple form here that's going to post. And we've bound the form object to it, or the object that was passed in with the name form. Recall that that was our add menu item form object. And so we bound that to the form, and our action is /menu/add item. So often we have left off the action when we've been looking at our forms because we've set up our handlers to post to the same exact URL as the form is located at. That's the default behavior if you leave off the action attribute from the form element. In this case, though, we specifically placed the action attribute on the form element because the URL at which this form will be rendered will have the menu ID on as part of the URL, right? So our form processor our form processing handler rather, is going to respond to requests at /menu/add item. And so, we've taken off that particular integer identifier from the end of the form path. And so we specifically need to post to this specific URL because it's ever so slightly different from the URL at which the form is displayed. So within the form, we only have one input, or one visible input, I should say. The one visible input is the select, which will be the drop-down that contains each cheese in the system that the user may choose from in order to determine, what they wanted to add to the menu. And we use our form helper tags here, th4, th-each, th-text, th-value, etc. These are all things that we've become very used to over the last few weeks. There's one new input down here below though. So this input will allow the user to select an item and it will post the ID of the particular item that they choose. But we also need to know the menu ID that they want to add that item to, right? So when we're receiving this information in our handler, if they just tell us which cheese they want to add to a menu and we don't know which menu that is, we're going to be at a loss. We're not going to be able to deal with their request. So we also need to post the specific menu ID of the item that they want to add their new cheese to. Now, this is not an item that the user needs to select, right? They've already said that they want to add a menu item to a specific menu. And so, this is a common situation in web development where you have a parameter that you want to be part of a form post request, but the user doesn't need to select that parameter. And that's the case here. So we want this parameter, this menu ID parameter, to be posted to the form processing handler, but we already know what the menu ID is. We don't need the user to select it. So we can just put it in a hidden input element. So type equals hidden will generate an input element that is hidden to the user, but is still part of the post request made to our application. All right, so that's our add item view. Let's go back to the controller and see how we process that form submission. So here in the add item handler that's associated with the post request, we see that we are, there we go, that's a little bit better. We see that we are taking in an add menu item form object, and that is going to be a model attribute. So we're going to use model binding. So the framework will build that object up for us based on the submitted form data, and we're going to validate it. We're going to say that that should be a valid object, and then we of course have the errors, which will allow us to check to see if the validation caught any errors as it was building up the object. The first thing we do within the class, or within the method rather, is to check for errors. If there are errors, we simply return back to the form, and based on the code we've set up, the user will be notified of those errors. If there are not errors, we go ahead and continue processing. The first thing we do is we go ahead and retrieve the cheese that the user submitted. So they submitted the ID of the item that they wanted to add to the menu. And so we use the cheese DAO interface to find that particular cheese with that particular ID. So we say form.getCheeseID to get that ID, and then use the interface to return that to us here in the handler. We do the same thing with the menu. So there were two pieces of data that were submitted, the cheese ID and the menu ID. We retrieve the objects associated with each of those IDs via their respective data access objects. And then finally, we say that we should add the item to the menu. So we say menu.addItem cheese. Okay, so at this point, we've retrieved the cheese, we've retrieved the menu, we've put the cheese into the menu. However, those changes haven't been reflected in the database yet. So this is a common sort of, a common gotcha or a common mistake of developers just getting used to working with Spring Data in Hibernate, which is that you can update an object that is stored in the database, but when you're updating it in your code, those changes aren't just automatically pushed back to the database. We have to manually say, hey, put this in the database or update this in the database. So even though we've added the item to our menu here, that change hasn't been pushed back to the database. So if you didn't have this next line, menu.dao.save, where we save the menu, that change would be lost the next time you refreshed your application, or the next time you refresh the page. So while you went to all the work of, finding the cheese and finding the menu and putting the cheese in the menu, that update would have been lost once this request was finished processing if you didn't actually save that change. And so far we've only seen that the DAO.save being called on a new item. You can also use it to save the status of an existing item, to update the status of an existing item. So that's what we're doing here. By saying menu DAO.save the menu, we're saying, hey database, update this thing that we just got from you a few minutes ago, or a few seconds ago rather. And then once we're done, we return to the menu view for the menu in question and display the menu with the new item on the menu. All right. So that's all of the new code in our menu controller and all of the views associated with those controller handlers. Again, we're going to guide you through the process of creating that code yourself and getting this to work on your own in a walkthrough that you'll do in class. So thanks for watching, thanks for learning, and happy coding.